Every year, the National Urban League releases its highly anticipated report on the state of Black America. The report has become the national touchstone for the social and economic status of African American and Hispanic communities. Each year, we ask the question, what is the state of Black America? Today, our esteemed panelists will answer that question and discuss solutions and best practices for overcoming the challenges facing our communities. So what is the state of Black America, and how do we improve it? Joining me to discuss is Laura Murphy, Director, Washington Legislative Office, American Civil Liberties Union, Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., President and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus, and Chanel Hardy, Senior Vice President for Policy and Executive Director of the National Urban League Policy Institute. Welcome, one and all. So you all may know that the theme of this State of Black America is Redeem the Dream, Jobs Rebuild America. And the National Urban League is engaged in a Jobs Rebuild America program. We have this conversation readily, but at the end of the day, why is employment and jobs so important? Rev, we'll start with you.
Well, first, let me just say this, that I'm just a big fan of the Urban League for doing this. I think it's so important to have this conversation because one of the things that we need to have for our community is research and development and think tanks and to really discuss the issues and the numbers so we can know what we can do and how far we've come. Clearly right now at this point in time, this is a great time. It's also a terrible time. Great time meaning that, man, we have Black governors, Black mayors, we have a Black president, we have, Black entertainers.
Black unemployment.
We do, but then you go. And then the other side, we have some of the worst Black unemployment we've ever had.
And if we're talking about equity and empowerment, Chanel, when we begin to talk about jobs, why do we not have equity and empowerment if we don't have full employment?
If we don't have full employment, then we don't have income equality. Unemployment is the principal barrier to income equality. There's another conversation about wealth,
right,
but most of the household income for all families comes from your wages. And so as long as we have a problem in terms of employment, we won't be able to close that gap. We're making some real progress in other areas in terms of the gap in educational achievement, for example. But in terms of being able to stand on your own 2 feet in a capitalist country, we've still got a long way to go. And I think that the story of State of Black America 2013 is that African Americans have demonstrated over the past 50 years that we have a commitment to progress. We've been working very hard and we've achieved tremendous results within our community. But the gap persists, and part of that has to do with what solutions need to happen at the policy level, and part of that has to do with the country having a conversation about racial discrimination and its persistence.
Well, and let's deal with that, because when I've never in my not so young life heard a national discussion that made the American people feel like there was a great responsibility for Congress and the president to create jobs. As we start talking about that policy issue, who really is responsible for creating jobs? What's the job creation formula? And is that really what we're talking about?
Well, I think no demand is answered unless there's a demand from the people. And I think that we ultimately are responsible for demanding that our elected officials address the needs of our communities. And I feel like in the Obama era, some Black leaders have kind of muted their criticism because it's the first Black president. But we have both joy in that, and we also despair about the condition of young Black people, the condition of their schools, the school to prison pipeline, where a Black child is 3.5 times more likely to be expelled from school than a white child. We still have corporal punishment in our schools. We have over-policing in our schools, and with the Newtown gun violence, the president is asking for more school resource officers. They don't all have to be police, but Congress is pushing for more police in schools, and that means that kids are getting criminal records before they even graduate from high school on things like talking back to the teacher or scribbling on the desk. So I think we have to take control of our communities, and we have to use institutions, great institutions like the National Urban League, to assure that our voices are heard by the elected officials.
Well, and the school to prison pipeline is one of the biggest barriers to employment. I mean, you're blocking young people at the earliest stages from access to the school of their choice. Their records are barred, so there's certain employment they can't get. Rev, as we begin to deal with the politics of that, how do we begin to fight the school to prison pipeline, not simply with a moral imperative, but with an economic one?
Make a step back. So I agree. We'll deal with the prison, the cradle to prison pipeline. But let me just say something that you just said, which is so important as institutions and as a community. We as a people, this is not a new issue. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Jobs and Freedom March in Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. What's key about that is that jobs was an issue then. So 50 years later, we should have some kind of understanding, some kind of wherewithal to say, listen, we're going to fix this ourselves. How are we going to use our HBCUs? How are we going to create more job owners? How are we going to create more opportunity in our communities? So I think that we have to look back at ourselves clearly that this is not a new discussion. With that being the case, we also know we do have a lot of young people who are being put in prisons or being caught up in the criminal justice system. And I think that is also hampering them with felons and other issues. But we must first go back to the educational component. We must first go back to how we create more wealth in our community, but also figure out what we must do to really create jobs for our community.
But let's pause for a second,
Yes.
because I want to expand out, but I want to make sure we don't skip over the
Most
school
definitely.
to prison piece. What is the solution? Because we know that this is not really about federal policy as much as it's about engaging on the ground at local levels, state legislatures, local school boards. Who have you seen having the right kind of conversation? This really is for any of you. Yeah. Who have you seen having the right kind of conversation, and what are the kind of policy recommendations that we're seeing at the local level to say this isn't acceptable?
The Senate recently held a hearing. Senator Harkin, who heads up the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, and he is very much opposed to cops in schools. We see that when police are in schools, that kids are more likely to be suspended and put out of school completely.
What the expectation is also.
Right. And so we have to understand as a community that minority kids are no less well-behaved than white kids, but we face discrimination by police officers who are not trained in the educational system. They're not trained to support kids. So we support positive behavioral support systems so that there are incentives. And Colorado is a good example. Colorado had a lot of police in school, had a lot of expulsions, and they turned their system around so that they had more school counselors, they had more after-school activities, and the rate of expulsions just dropped dramatically. So in those jurisdictions where the discrimination has been pointed out and the community has gotten engaged, they have seen a real decline in kids getting caught up in the criminal justice system.
We're also seeing
I want to actually say something because you mentioned the economics of this issue, and I think it's a tricky conversation because the truth is that there is an economic benefit in many cases for having a prison complex. Right. So as a congressional staffer, there are many times where officials from a small town would say, we need appropriations to build a jail so we can bring jobs into the community. One of the issues that we're fighting in the National Urban League is the crazy ways in which prisoners are subjected to monopoly services. So for example, paying 10 times the rate for a phone call. That's making serious money for a particular group of industries, and that's a powerful lobby.
Not to mention the low-cost labor.
Right, to keep the prison complex fed. I think that the exciting conversation is the conversation by officials who are saying it also costs a lot of taxpayer money. So there's money being made on the private sector, but there's a lot of taxpayer money that's going to pay for people to be in prison. Right. And as Laura points out, more money often being spent on incarcerating than educating. And so let's have a conversation about how we want to spend our money. And if we're trying to create a situation where we spend less taxpayer money putting people in jail and keeping them in jail, and then taking care of them after they come out of jail and can't be employed, but instead invested on the front end, that would help our global competitiveness as we have a workforce that's actually prepared and not barred from taking the jobs that are available.
And there's also, before we move from this, there's also a further earlier stage, which is what is the disciplinary practices of local schools.
Right.
The Schott Foundation is pushing to create a moratorium on suspensions until you're able to deal with, because we know, very similar to young men and women going into prison, when young men and women are suspended for 2 to 3 days, they further and further move from effective matriculation and graduation, setting them up for that very piece. So it's a broad conversation, which is going to take a number of entry points for us to be able to deal with.
But it's an important conversation.
No, it is. And Rev, you said something earlier, Chanel, that I want you to deal with. Rev talked about how do we use the tools at our disposal to create jobs for ourselves. And when you're looking at the state of Black America, the numbers in the report, what are the indicators that say here are the spaces where we as a community can internally create jobs, even as we fight on these other political fronts?
Yeah, one quick piece I think as we look at and learn from history in State of Black America 2013 is that we have a rich history of entrepreneurship in our community. So there was, Peachtree Street in Georgia. We had our own businesses when segregation prevented us from accessing white-owned businesses. Then we had integration and we abandoned, unfortunately, many of our businesses. Now we're seeing an absolute 180-degree shift where now African Americans are the highest growing entrepreneurial population. As we look at industries where there's most growth and where most of those businesses have a chance of survival, because we know that the small business survival statistics are low. It's in the STEM industries, it's in tech, it's also in healthcare, and it's also in education. So the interesting thing is, even as we're talking about cutting public dollars for education, and there's an ongoing controversy about public dollars for healthcare, those industries on the private sector are growing. And as we have charter schools on the rise and other alternative forms of schools, there's money being made there. And our population has to get into those industries as well.
Let's do this, because we don't have an infinite amount of time for this discussion. But clearly there are people at home right now watching who are either unemployed, have been a part of that unemployed group for years, not just months. We have those that are advocates that really want to push to create employment and earning equity. And then we have those that just say, wait a minute, I just want my community to look better. In 30 seconds, what would be one thing that you would say to them that they can do as they turn this off and get involved in the process?
I'd say it's important to be a member or to go to community meetings. You'll meet elected officials. You may find out about new businesses moving to the community. Go to your local NAACP meeting. Go to your local town hall meeting. Go to your school board meetings. Go to your city council meetings. All of these meetings are open to the public. Opportunity's not going to come knocking at your door into your living room saying, here's the opportunity. You're going to have to come out and make yourself seen.
And go wanting something in return.
Go wanting something in return, but arm yourself with information about what's going on in your community.
Rev?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think it's clearly policy is important, and finding out about a policy. Either you shape policy or policy shapes you. And so you have to recognize that. But I would also say for those who are watching this, as you said, who are home, I would first say don't be discouraged. There is opportunity in the land. So it's out there. There is opportunities for you. You might have to be retrained. You might have to go back to school. You might have to figure some things out. But work to figure out where it is in your community, that opportunity. But also work within your community. Figure out where in your community how you can work together with your neighbor or your coworker to find new things to do.
Great. Thank you, Chanel.
Well, I'm going to, of course, say go to your local urban league and get trained. Go to an entrepreneurship center and get your business incubated. And then I think we have to go back to Laura's point, which is just so critical. There may be jobs coming to your community. We're talking about this in DC right now where we have a major redevelopment project going on. But if you're not at the table when these conversations are being held about who's going to get those jobs, then you can be trained all you want. and you're not going to be able to access the jobs that are actually available in your community.
And that really is what this panel is about, is accessing solutions that you can use, because we're not going to figure out the jobless problem in 15 minutes, but collectively we're going to do it together. Thank my panelists for participating in this dynamic conversation. Share this web series, please, with your local social media friends and followers. Let's continue this solution session using hashtag SOBA13. Now you get involved. The State of Black America web series is presented by AT&T, and we want to thank them for their continued support of the National Urban League. We also thank Comcast for their production support of the State of Black America web series. Together, we are empowering communities and changing lives. You can join me every Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. on my digital show, The Intersection, at www.bliss, that's BLIS.FM, or follow me on Twitter at Jeff's Nation. For more information on the State of Black America and to purchase the book, which you should purchase, visit the National Urban League at nul.org.
Hello, National Urban League. My name is Cynthia Marshall, Senior Vice President for Human Resources for AT&T. On behalf of our more than 240,000 employees, we're excited to support, for the third year, the National Urban League's State of Black America report and discussion. Our commitment to diversity is vital to the success of our company. For AT&T, an innovative, diverse, and competitive workforce ultimately begins with providing better educational opportunities for everyone. And that is why we remain supportive of the State of Black America's report. I am reminded of Maya Angelou's beautiful statement about all threads in the tapestry being equal in value, no matter what their color. Or the poignant words of Mikhail Gorbachev, that peace is not unity in sameness, but unity in diversity. For AT&T, this understanding of diversity's value is one of our bedrock convictions. Our partnership with you underscores our deep commitment to diversity and empowerment. And so today, we salute the National Urban League on another successful, substantive, and thought-provoking report. Job well done, Mark Morial.